They tampered with his food. That one sentence would flip the entire night upside down. And the man they chose to mess with owned the restaurant. Before we begin, if you enjoy powerful stories where the underdog exposes the truth, make sure to subscribe, hit like, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's dive in. Ethan Caldwell sat quietly at table 19, tucked away in the back corner of the Hearth, Miami's most exclusive restaurant. He wore a plain black hoodie, worn sneakers, and a scratched leather watch. To everyone else, he looked like just another middle-aged man trying to enjoy a quiet dinner, but no one in this room knew the truth. Ethan Caldwell owned this place. He built Caldwell Enterprises from the ground up, turning a small garage startup into a $1.5 billion empire that spanned real estate, blockchain, and luxury dining. The Hearth was supposed to be his crown jewel, a symbol of elegance and fairness. Tonight, he came unannounced, undercover, without security, without his entourage, wanting to see for himself whether the anonymous email he received 3 nights ago was telling the truth. That email accused the Hearth of a dark secret: black customers were treated differently, service denied, orders delayed, and in some cases, food deliberately tampered with. Ethan didn't want to believe it, but what happened next left no room for doubt. From the moment he walked in, he felt the difference. The hostess, a young blonde woman in a sleek black dress, scanned him from head to toe, her smile forced and cold. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I do," Ethan replied calmly. "Caldwell. Table 19. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't recognize the name. "Right," she muttered, grabbing a menu without another word, leading him past rows of marble tables and polished wine racks until she placed him near the kitchen door, where the air smelled faintly of grease. It was subtle, but deliberate. 12 minutes passed. No water. No bread. Servers floated around him, cheerful smiles reserved for the wealthy white patrons sipping $900 steaks and $300 bottles of Chateau Margaux. Then she appeared, Maya Johnson, a 28-year-old black waitress, balancing a tray of glasses with steady hands but nervous eyes. She'd been working double shifts to pay off her late father's medical debts, enduring constant criticism from the management, but tonight, she had no choice but to act. As she refilled Ethan's water, she slipped a folded napkin beneath his coffee cup, her voice barely above a whisper, "Sir, don't eat here." Without waiting for his reaction, she straightened her back, forced a polite smile, and walked away. Ethan unfolded the napkin and froze as he read the rushed, messy handwriting: "They tampered with your food. Check the cameras. This place is rotten." For a moment, Ethan didn't move. His jaw tightened, his fingers pressed hard against the table. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on Jaden Brooks, the black bartender polishing a glass behind the bar, watching him discreetly. When their eyes met, Jaden gave the smallest nod, then turned away as if nothing happened. Ethan understood instantly. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was organized. Through the kitchen doors, muffled laughter erupted. He saw Carl, the head chef, waving a steak knife as he bragged to 2 sous chefs. "You should have seen his face," Carl sneered. "Another one thinking he belongs here. Richard's gonna love this." Richard Vaughn, the restaurant's manager. Ethan leaned back, processing every word, his expression neutral, his mind razor-sharp. This was no longer dinner. This was war. Minutes later, Maya returned, pretending to clear a nearby table. "They've been doing this for months," she whispered under her breath. "Black customers. Anyone who looks out of place." Ethan's voice was calm but low. "Who's behind it?" Maya hesitated, glancing toward the manager's office. "Richard," she said finally. "He tells Carl who to target. Jaden's been keeping recordings, but," she stopped, fear flashing in her eyes. "If they find out I warned you, I'll lose my job." Ethan placed his hand over the napkin and whispered, "Don't worry. You did the right thing. Across the room, Richard Vaughn stepped out of his office, tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive tailored suit and a polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. He whispered something to the hostess, who nodded quickly and glanced toward Ethan. Richard walked straight into the kitchen, his hand tightening around his cufflinks, his jaw set. Seconds later, Carl vanished into the back, slamming the door shut. They knew something. They suspected Maya. They were covering their tracks. Ethan stayed calm, sipping his water, watching every move. He wasn't just a customer tonight. He was the hunter. At the bar, Jaden subtly mouthed 2 words, "Check cameras." That was confirmation enough. Ethan pulled his phone from his hoodie pocket and opened a secure app connected to Caldwell Enterprises' legal team. With 3 quick taps, he sent an encrypted message, "Pull every kitchen camera feed from tonight. Now." 20 minutes later, Ethan rose from his seat, leaving the untouched $900 steak on the table. As he walked past Maya, he gave her a slight nod, silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. Tonight was only the beginning. He wasn't leaving angry. He was leaving prepared. Because Ethan Caldwell wasn't just a billionaire. He wasn't just the restaurant's owner. He was about to burn this entire rotten system to the ground. Ethan Caldwell left the Hearth that night with a quiet fury burning inside him, but when he returned the next evening, disguised again in his black hoodie and worn sneakers, he came prepared. His legal team had already begun pulling encrypted backups of every camera feed from the kitchen and staff areas, and what they discovered only confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just one bad decision, it was a rotten system built to humiliate and exclude. Ethan walked back through the glass doors and immediately noticed the same subtle hostility as before, the same cold glances from the hostess stand, the same whispered exchanges between staff members who assumed he didn't belong. But this time, he wasn't here just to observe. He was here to document. As he took his seat at the same table near the kitchen door, he noticed Maya Johnson already moving quickly between tables, pretending to work while keeping a careful eye on him. Her movements were sharp but controlled, her expression calm but tense, as if every second could be the one where Richard Vaughn discovered her secret. She had risked everything the night before by slipping him that napkin, and Ethan intended to make sure it wasn't for nothing. He could see Jaden Brooks at the bar too, quietly setting up his phone under the counter to record audio from the kitchen. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Across the dining room, Richard Vaughn emerged from his office, his silver hair slicked back, his tailored suit flawless, his expression carrying the same mix of arrogance and authority that had built his reputation as an untouchable manager. But Ethan had already seen the footage, recordings of Carl, the head chef, deliberately tampering with the meals of black customers under Richard's orders. Jaden had provided 3 separate clips, each time capturing Carl's mocking laughter as he bragged about teaching people their place. In one recording, Richard could be heard chuckling in the background, telling Carl which tables to slow down service for and which guests to make uncomfortable. It was subtle, methodical, and cruel. Ethan listened without reacting as he replayed the clips in his earpiece, his mind already racing ahead to the confrontation he knew was coming. Meanwhile, Maya moved carefully toward his table again, placing a glass of water in front of him without making eye contact. Under her breath, so soft it was almost inaudible, she whispered, "Be careful. Richard's watching you." Ethan didn't respond, but his eyes briefly met hers, steady and reassuring, letting her know she wasn't alone. He leaned back in his chair, scanning the room like a predator studying his surroundings. He noticed patterns now that he hadn't caught before, black couples seated near restrooms, single black patrons placed by the kitchen door where foot traffic was constant and noisy, while white diners were escorted to the front, seated under soft lighting with expansive window views. Orders for the front tables arrived within 5 minutes. Orders for the back tables, where he sat, took 25. The difference was deliberate, calculated, impossible to explain away as coincidence. Ethan clenched his jaw as Carl stepped out from the kitchen carrying a plate, smirking toward Jaden at the bar before glancing at Ethan like he was prey. Carl placed the dish on a nearby table, leaning close to one of the servers, and whispered something that made her chuckle uncomfortably before walking away. This was the culture Richard had created, a place where discrimination hid behind expensive wine lists and polished walnut tables, where cruelty was passed off as customer curation, where people like Maya and Jaden were forced to choose between silence and survival. But tonight, silence would end. Ethan opened his phone discreetly under the table and reviewed the kitchen security feeds his legal team had recovered. On screen, he watched Carl spitting into a saucepan, laughing with another chef, while Richard leaned against the counter giving instructions about tonight's list. Ethan's chest tightened, his hand steady as he hit save, knowing this was the evidence that would bury them. Maya approached again, pretending to adjust the silverware, and whispered, "Richard knows you're not who you seem. He's been asking questions about you all day." Ethan gave the faintest smile and murmured, "Let him ask." Meanwhile, Richard circled the dining room like a hawk, pretending to check on guests but constantly glancing toward Ethan's table. His polished charm masked his suspicion, but his subtle signals to the staff were impossible to miss: quick gestures, small nods, silent commands. Within minutes, Ethan noticed a shift. Servers slowed their pace around him, conversations hushed when he passed, and from the corner of his eye, he caught the hostess disappearing into Richard's office. He knew exactly what was happening. They were preparing to erase evidence. Ethan opened his encrypted chat, sending a message to his head of security: "Lock down the Hearth servers now. Remote wipe disabled. Backup secured." Within seconds, his phone vibrated, confirmation received. Across the room, Jaden subtly adjusted his phone, tilting the microphone toward the kitchen as Carl's voice grew louder, angry, and careless. "I don't care who he is," Carl barked. "Richard said make him wait, so he waits." That was the final proof Ethan needed. He looked around the dining room one more time, absorbing the quiet hostility, the carefully crafted facade of luxury that hid a system built to demean people who looked like him. He glanced toward Maya, whose hands trembled slightly as she balanced a tray, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, yet still defiant. He looked toward Jaden, who gave him the smallest nod, the silent signal that all the recordings were uploading safely to the cloud. And then Ethan made his decision. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat, adjusting the sleeves of his hoodie. Richard noticed immediately, stepping forward with a practiced smile. "Is everything okay, sir?" Richard asked smoothly, his voice dripping with false warmth. Ethan studied him for a long, cold moment, letting the silence stretch until Richard shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Ethan said in a low, steady voice, "Not yet. But it will be." Richard frowned, confused, trying to read the meaning behind his words, but Ethan didn't give him time. He walked past the bar, brushing shoulders with Jaden as he whispered, "Upload everything. Do not stop until it's done." Jaden nodded, heart pounding, as Ethan made his way toward the door. As he stepped outside into the warm Miami night, he pulled out his phone again and sent a final message to his legal team: "Initiate Phase 1. Internal audit. Full compliance sweep. Effective immediately." Within hours, Caldwell Enterprises would quietly begin an investigation that would change the Hearth forever. Inside, Richard and Carl believed they still controlled the narrative. They had no idea the man they mocked, the man they tried to humiliate, was the one person who had the power to destroy everything they built. Tonight, Ethan walked away calm, but the storm was already forming. By the time it hit, there would be nowhere for them to hide. The following night, Ethan Caldwell returned to the Hearth one last time, but this time he came armed with the truth, evidence, and absolute control. The city was alive outside, Miami's lights flickering against the glass walls of the restaurant, but inside, a quiet storm was brewing. Ethan wore the same black hoodie, the same worn sneakers, and the same calm expression, but everything else had changed. His legal team had sent him the recovered camera footage earlier that day, unearthing every deleted file, every malfunction, and every moment Richard Vaughn thought he had erased forever. Ethan had watched the videos in silence, jaw tightening as he saw Carl deliberately tamper with plates while laughing at black customers, mocking their accents, sneering at their clothes, and wiping his hands on dishes before sending them out. He saw Richard leaning in, giving instructions, his voice calm and calculated. Table 6, delay them 15 minutes. Table 9, send the wrong wine. Table 19, and then Richard smiled in the footage, lowering his voice, make him regret showing up. That was the final straw. Ethan entered the Hearth and sat at the same table 19, knowing every camera was now streaming live to Caldwell Enterprises servers, secured, untouchable. Maya Johnson approached cautiously, her movements slower than usual, her face pale but composed. She whispered as she poured his water, Richard suspects something. He's been asking about you all day. Ethan's voice was calm, steady, almost chilling in its quiet confidence. Good. Let him ask. Jaden Brooks caught his eye from the bar, subtly tapping his pocket. The recordings were safe, backed up to 3 separate servers. Across the room, Richard Vaughn emerged from his office, immaculate as ever in a navy suit and silver cufflinks, his smile polished but hollow, his cold blue eyes narrowing as he spotted Ethan. He approached slowly, like a predator pretending to be polite. Mr. Caldwell, is it? Richard said smoothly, feigning ignorance even though he'd clearly done his homework. I understand you've been dining with us quite a bit lately. Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. I like to see things for myself, he said evenly, his voice carrying just enough weight to make Richard shift uncomfortably. Richard smiled tightly, tilting his head. Of course. I just hope everything has been satisfactory. Ethan paused, letting silence stretch just long enough to make the air heavy between them. That depends, he finally said. Is it your policy to spit in the food of black customers, or do you reserve that privilege for me? Richard's face stiffened, his fake smile cracking for the first time. Excuse me, he said sharply, glancing around to make sure nearby diners couldn't hear. Ethan's tone remained controlled, his eyes locked on Richard's. I have every kitchen camera feed. Every recording. Every conversation. I know exactly what you and Carl have been doing. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His polished confidence faltered as he searched for a response, but Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice low and lethal. So before you say another word, think very carefully. Because every lie you tell me right now will be played back in a courtroom. Richard swallowed hard, glancing toward the bar where Jaden pretended not to watch, toward the kitchen where Carl had just stepped out wiping his hands on a towel, and then back to Ethan, who sat perfectly still, commanding the entire room without raising his voice. I think you're mistaken, Richard finally managed, forcing a laugh that didn't land. I would never. Ethan raised a hand, cutting him off instantly, his voice suddenly cold. Save it. I sign your paycheck. The words hit like a thunderclap, and Richard froze completely, color draining from his face as the realization settled in. Around the room, Maya stopped mid-step, Jaden's hand tightened around a glass, and even Carl, still holding his towel, looked toward the table with confusion and dawning fear. Ethan leaned back slowly, his tone steady but sharp. This restaurant belongs to me. Caldwell Enterprises owns every wall, every table, every paycheck in this building. And you've been running it like your personal playground. Richard's carefully constructed mask collapsed. He opened his mouth to speak, but Ethan was already ahead of him. Carl's recorded bragging about tampering with food under your orders. Jaden has logs of every shift, every complaint you buried, every black customer you humiliated. Ethan's voice lowered even further, lethal in its calmness, and before you even think about deleting anything else, my servers already have it all. Nothing's gone. Richard turned pale, his hands tightening at his sides as Carl approached, whispering, "What's going on?" Richard shot him a sharp look, but Ethan answered instead, his gaze cutting straight through Carl. "What's going on is that you're finished." Carl sneered, trying to regain control, but Ethan didn't flinch. You thought this place made you powerful, Ethan continued, his voice like steel, but power doesn't come from a title, Carl. It comes from accountability. And tonight, every single person in this restaurant is about to see what accountability looks like. Ethan stood slowly, his chair sliding back with a soft scrape, the quiet sound somehow louder than the chatter of the entire dining room. Maya stood frozen nearby, her breath caught in her chest, while Jaden subtly angled his phone toward the confrontation, capturing every second. Richard took a step back, his fake confidence crumbling under Ethan's steady gaze. "Listen," Richard said finally, lowering his voice, "we can handle this quietly, no need to." Ethan's laugh was soft, humorless, terrifying in its restraint. "Quietly? You humiliated my customers, my employees, and you poisoned my brand, and you want quiet?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "You should pray this doesn't go viral." As if on cue, two customers at a nearby table had already started recording on their phones, sensing something monumental unfolding. Richard glanced around, realizing too late that the walls were closing in. Ethan stepped back, sliding his phone across the table toward Richard, the screen glowing with a paused video, Carl spitting into a pan, laughing, while Richard's voice in the background gave instructions. Richard's lips parted, but no words came. Ethan's tone was final, unyielding, "Get out of my restaurant. Now." Silence rippled across the dining room as every eye turned toward them. Richard hesitated, but Ethan's stare didn't waver. After a long, painful beat, Richard turned on his heel and walked out, his expensive shoes striking the marble floor like hammer blows. Carl followed, his face flushed with anger and fear. The room remained silent until the door closed behind them, and only then did Ethan turn to Maya, his expression softening for the first time that night. "You're safe now," he said gently, and for the first time in months, Maya allowed herself to breathe. But Ethan wasn't done. He pulled out his phone one more time, sending a single encrypted message to his legal team, "Full audit. Immediate termination. Press release drafted by morning." Tonight was only the beginning. The system was rotten, but by tomorrow, the entire city would know exactly how deep it went. By the next morning, the quiet storm inside the Hearth had turned into a full-blown reckoning. At 7 a.m., Ethan Caldwell's legal team descended on the restaurant, their black sedans pulling up along the Wynwood District sidewalk as if an FBI task force had arrived. Inside, Richard Vaughn sat in his office, pale and restless, nursing a coffee he could barely hold steady, his phone buzzing endlessly with missed calls from corporate headquarters he dared not answer. Carl paced the kitchen, barking at staff to act normal while wiping sweat from his forehead, but there was no pretending now, the system they built was collapsing. Ethan entered through the front doors dressed differently this time, no hoodie, no sneakers, but a perfectly tailored navy suit, black tie, and polished shoes, his quiet authority unmistakable. Conversation stopped the moment he walked in, every head turning, every whisper halting mid-sentence. He walked straight past the hostess, straight past Richard's office door, and into the main dining area where Maya and Jaden stood waiting, both of them nervous but resolute. Ethan's calm voice carried effortlessly across the room, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Hearth is closed today for restructuring." The announcement rippled like an earthquake, confusion spreading among staff and lingering customers alike, but Ethan wasn't finished. He turned slowly, his gaze locking on Richard, who had finally stepped out of his office, attempting to summon what little authority he thought he had left. "You can't do this," Richard stammered, his voice brittle, his tone collapsing under its own weight. Ethan's reply was quiet, measured, and devastating, "I own this restaurant. I can do whatever I want." The silence was suffocating. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Richard and Carl could hear, "The kitchen cameras. The audio logs. The employee complaints you buried. I have it all. Every word. Every laugh. Every single thing you thought you deleted." Richard's lips parted, but no sound came out. His power was gone, stripped from him with one quiet sentence. Ethan turned to his legal counsel, gesturing slightly, and two corporate investigators stepped forward holding sealed folders. "Mr. Vaughn," one of them said firmly, "you are officially suspended pending investigation into workplace misconduct, discrimination, and food tampering under Florida statutes." The weight of the words dropped like a hammer, and a murmur spread through the room as staff glanced at one another in shock. Carl tried to protest, stepping forward aggressively, but Ethan's head of security intercepted him, sliding a thick document across the counter. "And you, Mr. Carlisle Hayes," the investigator announced, "are also suspended effective immediately. Law enforcement has been notified, and we recommend you remain available for questioning." Carl's face turned crimson, his fists clenching at his sides as he stared at Ethan, but Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "You had a choice," Ethan said coldly. "You chose cruelty. Now you face consequences." At that moment, two uniformed Miami-Dade police officers entered quietly through the side entrance, flanking the investigators as if to signal that resistance was useless. Richard froze, his shoulders sagging, Carl swore under his breath, and several chefs backed away, suddenly eager to distance themselves from the disaster unfolding. Maya stood off to the side, gripping the edge of a table, her knuckles white, her breath unsteady. She had risked everything with that napkin, and now she watched as justice unfolded right in front of her. Ethan turned toward her and Jaden, his expression softening briefly, his voice carrying reassurance meant only for them, "You're safe now. Neither of you will lose your jobs. In fact, that changes today." The announcement drew startled looks from the remaining staff, some whispering to one another while others stared at Maya with new respect. Ethan straightened, his voice rising again for the entire room to hear. "For months, this restaurant has fostered a culture of humiliation, exclusion, and racial bias. That ends now. The Hearth will close temporarily for a complete restructuring, new leadership, new policies, and a zero-tolerance code of ethics." Cameras from nearby news outlets had already begun rolling as word spread through Miami's social media networks about a billionaire CEO shutting down his own restaurant mid-shift. Within minutes, #The Hearth Exposed was trending nationwide, and Ethan's carefully calculated actions were becoming a public symbol of accountability. Reporters gathered outside, flashing lights reflecting off the restaurant's glass walls, while customers flooded the comment sections online, expressing outrage at what they had learned. Ethan walked to the center of the dining area, resting one hand on the back of a chair as he addressed everyone present, his voice calm but carrying a quiet intensity that commanded attention. "This isn't about one bad manager or one head chef. This is about a rotten system. And when the system is broken, you don't patch it. You rebuild it from the ground up." Maya's eyes filled with tears, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment, while Jaden stood tall beside her, his jaw set with pride. Ethan placed a hand gently on Maya's shoulder, then turned to the staff. "Starting today, Maya Johnson will serve as Director of Ethics and Culture for the Hearth. She will ensure this place reflects the dignity and respect every guest and every employee deserves." Gasps spread through the room, but none louder than Maya's own, her hand covering her mouth as she whispered, I don't know what to say." Ethan smiled faintly, his voice soft, "Say yes." Jaden, standing beside her, received his own promotion on the spot as training manager, responsible for onboarding and mentoring new hires during the restructuring. The room erupted in hushed murmurs, disbelief mixing with cautious hope. Ethan then faced the remaining staff, his tone shifting back to steel. "If any of you participated in discrimination or harassment, your time here is over. But if you stayed silent because you were afraid, I'm giving you a choice. Step forward, speak the truth, and help us fix this." Slowly, one by one, several servers stepped forward, confirming Maya and Jaden's claims, providing names, dates, and details that strengthened the investigation. Ethan nodded, acknowledging their courage, and instructed his legal team to protect these employees from retaliation. Outside, the crowd had grown, news vans lining the block, curious onlookers pressing against the glass to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. Ethan finally stepped toward the front doors, flanked by his legal counsel, security, and the newly promoted Maya and Jaden. He paused briefly before facing the cameras, knowing this statement would set the tone for everything to come. His voice was steady, measured, but unmistakably powerful. This wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a pattern. A deliberate culture of discrimination and misconduct. And I want everyone watching to understand one thing: silence is complicity. We are rebuilding the Hearth to be a place where fairness is the foundation, not an afterthought. And that starts today. Flashbulbs exploded as reporters shouted questions, but Ethan gave no further comment, instead turning to walk Maya and Jaden back inside. The Hearth's doors would close for the next 3 months, but when they reopened, nothing would ever be the same. For Richard Vaughn and Carl Hayes, the investigation was only beginning. Subpoenas were already being issued, financial records frozen, and charges for health code violations and workplace discrimination looming. For Maya and Jaden, this was the start of something bigger than a single restaurant. They had become the faces of change. And for Ethan Caldwell, this was more than personal vindication. It was the first step in a broader mission to force accountability wherever his name stood on the front door. The Hearth had been rotten to its core, but today, justice had walked in and reclaimed it. 3 months later, the doors of the Hearth opened once again, but the restaurant that once hid a rotten system beneath polished glass and expensive menus was gone forever. Where cold marble walls once stood, vibrant murals now celebrated Miami's diverse history, painted by local artists Ethan personally commissioned to remind everyone who walked through these doors that dignity had no price tag. The elite exclusivity was gone, replaced by an atmosphere where every guest mattered, every voice was heard, and every employee felt safe. At the center of it all stood Maya Johnson, no longer carrying trays, no longer taking silent insults from management, now serving proudly as the new director of ethics and culture. She had spent the past 3 months working side by side with Ethan's corporate team, creating anonymous reporting systems, mandatory anti-bias training, and an employee council that ensured every decision reflected fairness and respect. Jaden Brooks, standing beside her as the training manager, led workshops for new hires, teaching not just customer service but empathy, dignity, and inclusion, principles the Hearth would now be built upon. Ethan Caldwell watched quietly from a distance as Maya addressed the staff during reopening day, his expression calm but proud, knowing this moment belonged to her and everyone who had chosen to stand on the right side of history. The crowd inside was packed with reporters, local leaders, and loyal customers who had followed the story from the beginning. Across social media, the hashtag The Hearth Reborn trended nationally as live streams from the event gained millions of views. But this was more than a relaunch, it was a statement. Ethan stepped forward briefly to address the media, his voice steady, his words deliberate, every pause carrying weight. This isn't just about a restaurant. This is about creating spaces where respect isn't optional, it's the standard. The Hearth was broken. We rebuilt it. And starting today, we're holding ourselves accountable to a higher code. Applause erupted across the room, but Ethan's reforms didn't stop at the Hearth. Within weeks, Caldwell Enterprises announced the Fairness First initiative, a nationwide program requiring all of its restaurants and hospitality businesses to undergo independent ethics audits, with findings made public for complete transparency. Ethan also committed $20 million to a scholarship fund supporting Black hospitality professionals seeking careers in management, naming the program after Maya's late father, whose struggles had pushed her to fight for change. Maya stood on stage, holding the framed napkin she had once slipped under Ethan's coffee cup, now displayed as a symbol of courage and truth. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but her message carried across every camera. This all started with one choice. One note. One moment of saying, enough. If you see something wrong, speak up. You might change more than you know. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a promise. Outside, a crowd gathered, cheering as employees opened the doors to welcome back guests under the restaurant's new vision. Customers of every background filled the tables, greeted warmly by a diverse staff who understood their worth, their role, and their responsibility. For Jaden, it was the first time in years he felt proud to wear the Hearth's name on his badge. For Maya, it was the realization of everything she had fought for, a workplace where no one would have to choose between silence and survival again. And for Ethan, standing near the back of the room watching Maya speak, it marked the beginning of something far larger than he had imagined. This wasn't just about saving one restaurant. It was about sparking a movement. The Hearth had been reborn, not as a place for the privileged few, but as a beacon of fairness, courage, and change. And as Ethan gazed at the framed napkin one last time, he whispered under his breath, almost to himself, sometimes the smallest voices build the loudest legacies.